At the turn of the 20th century, with Australia just beginning its life as a new nation, a tragedy was unfolding. From the remote coast of Western Australia to deep within its inhospitable interior, an immense engineering project was underway. A project so ambitious, it threatened to change the course of Australian history. At its heart were two men, a visionary premier and an engineering genius, bound together by a dream, a man-made river through the desert, the longest freshwater pipeline ever built, designed to unlock countless riches and help create a nation. In their struggle against the forces of nature and the forces of politics, one would be proclaimed a national hero, while the other would be driven to his death. This is a story of personal tragedy, political rivalries, corruption, and trial by media that nearly tore apart Australia at the moment of its birth. In March 1902, barely a year after Australian Federation, an inquest gathered in Fremantle to investigate the death of one of the new country's most significant figures. Although few realised it at the time, this death was bound up in the birth of the nation, when 6 self-governing colonies were united.
Clark.
On March the 10th, the day before the coronial inquest, 20-year-old Roderick O'Connor had discovered a note amongst his father's personal papers.
Roderick O'Connor, would you please take the stand?
It revealed the torment of a man who, ironically, was on the brink of celebrating his greatest professional achievement.
The position has become impossible. Anxious, important work to do, and 3 commissions of inquiry to attend to. We may not have done as well as possible in the past, but we will necessarily be too hampered to do well in the imminent future.
The note was written by Charles Yelverton O'Connor, Chief Engineer of Western Australia.
I feel that my brain is suffering, and I have great fear of what effect all this worry may have upon me. I have lost control of my thoughts.
An autopsy confirmed that O'Connor died from a single shot to the head, suicide. To those around him, he had the world at his feet. He had a well-paid career, was powerful, and had a loving family. Yet his suicide note makes no mention of his loved ones. O'Connor killed himself just months before completing one of the world's most extraordinary engineering marvels, a project that would have a profound impact on the fate of Western Australia.
O'Connor slingshot Western Australia from being, I guess, an industrial backwater to being at the forefront, the leading edge of industrial design, engineering and development.
I'm convinced that O'Connor was a great progenitor of the eventual success of Western Australia.
What drove a man like O'Connor to kill himself? The answer lies in his fateful relationship with one of Australia's most visionary and skilled political players.
The partnership between Sir John Forrest, Premier of Western Australia, and O'Connor was one of the most remarkable partnerships in Australian history. You have political vision combined with engineering skills coming together in a great infrastructure project which both symbolically and in practical reality links one half of the continent with the other half of the continent.
John Forrest was born to poor Scottish immigrants in Bunbury, Western Australia in 1847. But this native-born Australian would rise well beyond his humble roots to become one of the nation's founding fathers.
He had the sort of local fame that comes to famous footballers or tennis stars in our own day. The fact that as a young man he was the first homegrown explorer and his explorations had been successful and he got recognition.
Forrest was an ambitious man with an appetite for adventure.
I think we'll head through this way.
Accompanied on several occasions by his younger brother Alexander and Aboriginal tracker Tommy Windage, he led a number of expeditions into Western Australia's dead heart.
There are two fundamental reasons for the exploration. One was to find grass, and that was true right up to the 1870s. They were looking for grass, for pasturage. The second reason, of course, was to find out what was there. In those days, there were still lots of people who thought there were lakes in the middle.
Covering more than a third of the continent, Western Australia is vast and uncompromising. And despite initial settlement in 1826, by the late 1860s it was the only one of Australia's colonies dependent on convict labour and was virtually unexplored by whites. In 1874, Forrest embarked on the first expedition through central Western Australia to Adelaide. But he found little suitable land and almost no fresh water.
When Forrest went on his expedition looking for suitable land, the whole country was suitable. Suitable for what? That was the question. It was suitable for inhabitants of that particular place at that time.
When they did locate water near the South Australian border, official reports state they were attacked by a group of Aboriginals.
When you read historical documents, it's always, we were attacked. Now, why would they be coming towards you? They'd be coming towards you for many reasons. It could be warning you off and say, look, there's something happening here. This is ceremonial grounds. We're doing something here. We want to keep you away, so stay away.
On his arrival in Adelaide, Forrest was hailed as a hero, his tales of survival and exploration making him famous. Rewarded with pastoral leaseholds, Forrest and his brother soon became wealthy. After marrying into a well-connected and powerful family and being knighted for exploring the colony, Sir John Forrest was made Surveyor General and Commissioner of Crown Lands.
I move that this Parliament...
The position entitled him to a seat in Western Australia's small, non-elected parliament. In 1890, Western Australia was proclaimed a self-governing colony and John Forrest became its first elected Premier.
Sir John Forrest was the first native-born Australian Premier, and he was a sort of quintessential bearer of the new Australian consciousness.
If Australia could speak with one voice, how much more important would she be?
Forrest traded his bushman's hat for a business suit at a time when Australia was developing its own national identity. With pressing concerns about defence, immigration and internal trade, momentum was gathering to unite the 6 fractious colonies into a federated nation.
Western Australia was in a particularly difficult position with respect to the other parts of Australia, because not only was Western Australia separated by a long distance, but there was nothing in terms of transport, in terms of infrastructure that linked the two halves of the continent.
Sir John Forrest.
Our duty is clear to anyone who has faith in the colony.
As Premier of the newest and weakest of Australia's colonies, John Forrest believed that in order for Western Australia to become a fully functioning part of the Federation, it urgently needed massive infrastructure development.
It is a duty of improving our national estate, which is our inheritance which has come to us.
Forrest's grand vision for the development of agriculture and industry called for the construction of railways, new towns, roads and a deep water harbour. But he needed the capital to fund them, and even more importantly, someone who could build them. That someone was Charles Yelverton O'Connor. O'Connor had left his native Ireland and was building harbours and railways in New Zealand.
O'Connor came from that school of Victorian pioneers. They were imbued with the passion and optimism of the Industrial Revolution. Industry, machines, and development of that kind were going to change the world.
Soon O'Connor and his family would be heading 8,000 kilometres to one of the most remote cities on Earth. When he arrived in Perth on the 31st of May 1891, O'Connor was unaware that he was about to enter a political pressure cooker.
Mr. O'Connor, welcome.
O'Connor's engineering genius was now tied to Forrest's uncompromising vision.
May I inquire what the work will entail?
Railways, harbours, everything.
O'Connor undoubtedly was daunted by the amount of work that was on his plate.
He was put in charge of every possible aspect of infrastructure development in Western Australia, whether it was designing town halls, clocks, whether it was designing tanks to hold water.
I suspect that Forrest hadn't been entirely honest with him, and the demands on O'Connor were really superhuman. He was flooded with work.
Within 6 months of his arrival, O'Connor walked straight into controversy with his first bold plan that went against the orthodoxy. Perth desperately needed a deep water harbour. With no industry of any kind to build Forrest's dream, everything had to be brought in. A new harbour was critical. O'Connor insisted that it should be built where everyone else thought it was impossible, in the mouth of the Swan River.
I do not see how this site is any safer than Owen Anchorage.
Your concerns are unfounded.
O'Connor had a tough job, of course, convincing Parliament, convincing Forrest, that the great harbour should be in the Swan River, because other experts had said that this was impossible.
There were differences of opinion about Fremantle Harbour, and the significant thing is that Forrest allowed himself to be persuaded by O'Connor that, never mind the additional expense, that it was best to have it centred in Fremantle.
O'Connor's influence started to raise eyebrows among the tightly connected local elite, who seemed to mistrust outsiders and government expenditure. Forrest's own brother Alexander, now a wealthy grazier and businessman, was among the first and most strident of many hostile voices.
We may as well hand over the whole colony to this gentleman from New Zealand, who will, no doubt, show us how to spend our money.
Alexander Forrest was in the opposite camp to O'Connor about the Fremantle Harbour. I suspect that the psychology of it was simply that, as his brother, Alexander saw himself as John Forrest's oldest friend, and he was always a bit edgy about people like O'Connor who were also close to Forrest.
But with the combination of O'Connor's brains and Forrest's political and financial muscle, in February 1892, the plans were approved. Together they embarked on building the colony's new harbour at Fremantle. It was the first important stage of Forrest's great plan. The harbour would accommodate the largest steamers coming to Australia and link Forrest's planned expansion of the colony's rail network. With the harbour plans underway and confident in his abilities, O'Connor could begin to enjoy his new life in Western Australia. But events elsewhere were about to overtake everyone. On the 17th of September 1892, 500 kilometres across the dry heart of the territory, something happened that would change the fate of Western Australia. Prospector Arthur Bailey rode into Southern Cross, a remote mining centre 369 kilometres east of Perth. In his saddlebags were 554 ounces of gold. And so began Australia's last great gold rush. As the news spread, thousands of men from the eastern colonies and around the world began pouring in. Those in Perth nicknamed them T'othersiders.
When I arrived Just 3 weeks after Bailey reported his find, I could see from my camp numbers of men working on a flat. Great clouds of dust were rising from the scene of their operations. I inquired my way to Bailey's claim, and there I saw the first coarse gold I had ever seen. It was shining out like a jeweler's shop window.
Each new find caused a rise in the gold fever that gripped the colony, and makeshift towns mushroomed overnight, with Coolgardie, Kalgoorlie and Boulder growing from little more than a collection of tents to huge, sprawling mining communities.
Where the news of gold being found in such rich quantities, I mean, they were finding 100 ounces of gold to the ton. That was completely unheard of. Between 1893 and 1897, was that 4 years, over 800 gold mining companies were formed for Western Australia. Money poured in.
For the first time, the coffers of Australia's most underdeveloped colony started to swell and pushed Forrest's ambitions to new heights.
What is the object of building railways and opening up the country? That the country and the people here may flourish and build up and use these resources. Turn the desert into a smiling plain and build up a great country and make it a worthy offshoot of the great empire whence we or our fathers came.
Forrest's dream seemed within reach. Gold would help build a prosperous Western Australia that would rival the eastern colonies. And when the time was right, he would lead Western Australia into federation on its own terms.
The other colonies, particularly Victoria, had had 30 or 40 years in which they'd developed secondary industries under the cover of tariff protection. The gold rush presented a now or never opportunity in which Western Australia could catch up.
But the dream also relied on bringing the colony's political factions together.
There were many, many political balls that Forrest had to juggle in order to manage government in Western Australia. There was the labour movement, very dominant in the goldfields. There was the pastoralists who had their own conservative interests. There were, of course, the miners who were interested in building up the mining industry. But the major political parties were the protectionists and the free traders.
If her tariffs were identical, what a market within herself for free competition would there be?
However, soon Western Australia's golden opportunity was at risk. Not because of politics, but because of the harsh realities of the environment. These would turn O'Connor from building a harbour to an even greater challenge that would test him to breaking point.
When a new rush is reported, the first question is, how is it for water? When you meet a man on the track, this is his first inquiry. If you have water today, you can never be sure about tomorrow.
In the goldfields, dying of thirst was not the only danger. With the lack of water for sanitation, outbreaks of typhoid swept through the camps. Makeshift tent hospitals were packed with miners who had succumbed to the disease. Thousands of cases were recorded, and every day more and more were dying. The privations of the gold miners soon extended to the local indigenous people. Water holes used in the area for thousands of years were quickly depleted, while the woodlands in which they hunted and gathered food were stripped for fuel at a rate of 1,000 tons of timber per day.
When the settlers first came here, it was a big mass of trees. The trees themselves were the first things to suffer. And of course, once you'd remove the plant life, the animals would go. And once the animals have left, the food source for Aboriginal peoples actually went.
There is no doubt we have treated the blacks very badly. We have taken the country from them, destroyed their game, thus removing their only means of living. And then we expect them to change to our laws and standards of things. We have taught them all of the white man's vices, and then left them to die of starvation and disease. It is to our lasting shame.
With little rainfall and no surface water to speak of, water became more valuable than gold. To solve the problem, desalination plants using wood-fire condensers flourished. But as the goldfields' population grew, even the largest of condensers proved to be inadequate.
The key to development in the goldfields was a plentiful supply of water, not just for the people to drink, but for industry there.
The government knew that without the gold, and without the people it attracted, and without the capital that came from London, Western Australia was stuck.
Providing water to the goldfields seemed an impossible challenge.
Proposed catchment area at the goldfields with the projected rainfall will not meet the high demand.
Alexander Forrest received a proposal from a local businessman to build a pipeline from the coast.
Alexander!
He showed it to his brother.
There were people who thought that it was a very impractical idea. And there is some evidence that Forrest himself thought it was impractical.
Mr. Forrest.
Although Forrest initially dismissed the proposal, after showing the plans to the chief, as O'Connor had come to be known, the Premier soon changed his mind.
Pipeline? It was an idea that was being tossed around without any great specific gravity to it. I think where O'Connor's valuable is that he says, well, yes, it can be done.
This might just work.
There's been huge debates about who had the idea first, and it doesn't really matter because until O'Connor could make it practical and Forrest could get it through politics, it remained just a pipe dream.
It doesn't take a genius to come up with that idea. The genius is the person that can put it into practicality. And the genius in this case was, of course, O'Connor.
However, building the pipeline was not one project, but several. First, the water needed to be collected, requiring the construction of the highest dam built in Australia at that time. Second, it would then have to be lifted 300 metres over the Darling Ranges before being piped all the way to the goldfields. As well, O'Connor would have to transport thousands of tons of equipment and materials by rail. It was a massive undertaking and he needed help. To head his team, he hired Thomas Hodgson, a leading hydraulics engineer from Victoria. Hodgson began surveying thousands of square kilometres of land to find a suitable site for a dam. In 1895, this was the largest project of its kind ever attempted. The longest pipeline in the world in one of Britain's least developed colonies.
The British reaction to a young colonial upstart trying to engage in a project of not just Australian or British, but of global significance, a proposal that had never, ever been undertaken before. They did not believe the young colony would have the knowledge, the skill, the technical expertise, or any requirements to undertake such a project.
In Perth, too, there were already signs he was under heavy criticism. O'Connor's plan was seen as impossible by the public and professionals alike.
I hope he knows what he's doing.
And for every faction, one of the most effective mouthpieces was the press. There were over 50 newspapers in circulation in Western Australia. These newspapers provide valuable clues to the political pressure surrounding O'Connor and his ambitious scheme.
When the scheme was first put forward, there were already signs that C.Y. O'Connor was under heavy vitriolic criticism.
If Mr. O'Connor's scheme is sound, we might be wise to carry it out. But we doubt its soundness.
The proposal to spend millions of pounds of money on the fanciful project of a departmental engineer is simply outrageous nonsense.
No government has the right to ask us to sanction expenditure on a scheme which is bristling with falsehoods.
It is a scheme of madness.
The type of criticism levelled at him was more so to do with his work, but when the criticisms came and he read what was happening in the public eye, he took this to be a personal attack upon himself.
The Sunday Times, which I must quickly say had no relationship to the Sunday Times of today, the Sunday Times at the time was particularly venomous.
The Sunday Times editor was Charles Vosper, a firebrand journalist and parliamentarian with strong affiliations with gold miners. As the pipeline controversy began to rage, it exposed the colony's widening political gulfs.
In the goldfields, there had long been a sense of resentment about political power being centralised in Perth, about the lack of representation, and about what was thought to be neglect of the goldfields' needs and interests by the West Australian government.
Against this volatile political backdrop, O'Connor continued to develop the pipeline plans. As the pressure mounted, he became consumed by the scheme. And with the Fremantle Harbour still unfinished, his already massive workload intensified. In 1896, after months searching almost 5,000 square kilometres of virgin bush and following the Helena River, the survey team led by Hodgson found an ideal location for the dam. O'Connor's design called for the construction of the highest dam in the southern hemisphere, so large it would require massive quantities of state-of-the-art high-strength concrete. But he also faced the even bigger problem of how to pump water over 500 kilometres to the goldfields.
He worked out the total amount of horsepower required to pump that water, and he based that horsepower originally on 2 pumps. Well, of course, the pumps were going to be phenomenally large. So what eventuated from there, he broke it down into a series of pumping stations.
O'Connor divided the pipeline into 8 sections, each equipped with a reservoir and a steam-powered pumping station that could push the water some 60 kilometres to the next station. Construction would cost £2.5 million, double the colony's annual budget, an astronomical $25 billion in today's terms. Nothing like it had ever been attempted. Despite the wealth from the goldfields, Forrest knew there wasn't that sort of cash in the government coffers. He would need all of his political acumen to raise the funds, and that meant heading to London. For private business, the pipeline was a lucrative opportunity. But the chief believed that the government's public works department should build the pipeline. It would lead to bad blood.
Alexander Forrest represented business interests, and that was the cause, I think, of his animosity towards O'Connor, because O'Connor had no respect whatsoever for the old boy network and backhanders and what have you.
Is far more reliable for projects.
With millions of pounds being borrowed from Britain, the state's biggest landowners resented what they saw as money being diverted to the plight of t'other-siders. Politicians closely aligned to big business and landowners joined the chorus of jibes.
What about the private contractors?
Even before a metre of pipeline was laid, the two men were forced to defend themselves.
If a contract were let, and a contractor does not provide for catastrophes, and they necessarily occur, then he will probably go bankrupt and the government will have to bear the actual cost of the work.
Public, not private contractors.
There was so much disagreement over whether the pipeline would work, Forrest was forced to seek a second opinion. In 1896, he sent the plans to a commission of engineers in London. Now the British would decide on the feasibility of the project.
To ask for deliberate written opinions as to whether a thing is practicable, which anyone capable of an hour or two's consideration must realise is quite practicable, and to pay fees to engineers of eminence as they would be entitled to demand for such deliberate opinions, is ridiculous.
Forrest was taking a massive gamble. There was a chance the Commission of Engineers would reject the plans altogether. In 1897, a physically and mentally exhausted O'Connor had to travel to London to explain his pipeline scheme. For 8 months, the Commission of Engineers investigated every aspect of the proposal. His career and reputation were on the line.
If the engineers had rejected the proposal, that would have been a real smack in the eye for both Forrest and O'Connor, but I think Forrest was an early practitioner of that wise old saying, never set up a commission of inquiry unless you're quite sure about the outcome.
The Commission concluded the pipeline proposal was totally practical.
Congratulations, Mr. O'Connor. How is your health?
It vindicated his ability as an engineer.
People are still asking.
In January 1898, Forrest could, at last, officially order work to start.
You may now proceed to put the Coolgardie scheme in hand at once. To proceed with the railway to the weir site. To build the weir. To call for tenders for pumps and pipes. And generally, push on with the great work.
The fight had already taken 3 years. Now the struggle to build the impossible began. But as soon as excavation at the dam site commenced, there was a problem. An enormous fault line was discovered in the rock, requiring further drilling and digging to a depth of 30 metres below the riverbed. The new excavation delayed the construction of the dam by a further 12 months, and the press was quickly on O'Connor's back.
The progress at present being made at Mundaring seems to indicate that the first half pint of terry fluid will reach the goldfields at somewhere around 2000 AD.
When criticism was levelled at him, he tended to move away from his work and to concentrate on answering the criticisms one by one.
Whenever the proposal to supply 5 million gallons of water by pumping from Helena River is referred to as my proposal, it is only the case insofar as it's my opinion that is the best means of getting it there. And not in any way as being a fancy project of mine that I want to thrust upon the government and the country.
While O'Connor struggled on with the pipeline, suffering attacks on every front, the scheme was being drawn into arguments over the great national issue, federation.
John Forrest's vision was designed to one end, to turn Western Australia from a Cinderella state into an active, participating member of the Federation of Australia. That was his aim, that was what he was trying to get, and he knew it would take many years.
Speaking for the colony that I represent, I say that amongst the electors there is no great feeling in favour of federation.
Although pro-federation, Forrest wanted to delay joining the other colonies until his grand infrastructure plans were complete. A strategy that would ensure Western Australia was strong enough to be an equal partner.
Then they had better federate themselves and leave us alone.
But the newcomers on the goldfields had a different idea.
The Goldfields region was very pro-federationist. The population there was very considerably made up by people who'd come from the eastern colonies, and they also saw it as being in their interests, for many reasons, economic reasons as well, to join with the other colonies in a federation. This sense of grievance on the goldfields really came to a head when the Western Australian government made what was really quite a foolish decision to prohibit miners from sinking mines below a depth of 10 feet. This was a decision that was thought to be favourable to the mining companies, the growing mining companies, and unfavourable to the individual miners.
The miners are at the tender mercies of the leaseholders and the capitalists. The case for the alluvial miner is doomed. Stick to your colours, boys, and to hell with Sir John Forrest and any other animal like him. We will have our rights. If Forrest doesn't give us what we want, we will give him another Eureka Stockade. Go for him, boys, and demand your rights.
In March 1899, Forrest visited the goldfields to cool the growing discontent. But he was about to step into a political cauldron. Forrest was facing such strong opposition, he found himself more and more politically isolated. At the 1899 Premiers' Conference, the colonies, led by Victoria and New South Wales, agreed to each hold referendums on federation. But alone among them, Forrest refused to commit.
And I firmly believe that we should delay further still, for the good of the colony, our entry...
In Parliament, a powerful pro-federation lobby emerged. It believed Forrest was in reality an anti-federationist, using the excuse of fighting for a better deal to avoid joining altogether. The Eastern Goldfields Reform League published a manifesto outlining their grievances. They produced a 2-kilometre-long petition to Queen Victoria with 28,000 signatures, asking to separate from Western Australia. The new state, to be called Australia, would become part of a federated nation, without the rest of Western Australia.
The document should prove to the imperial authorities that unless the Eastern Goldfields can be separated from Western Australia, there will be a large community forced to accept and obey an oligarchy that robs them of their rights and justly receives their contempt and detestation.
Britain could have separated that area and created a separate state. In legal terms, Britain had the power to do that.
That would have ripped the economic bottom out of Western Australia.
Western Australia was now tearing itself apart. Forrest was desperate for O'Connor to make progress if he was to hold the colony together and get federation on his terms. Excavation at the dam site had recommenced. Construction of the wall required over 76,000 casks of cement. The foundations alone would take 19 months to complete. But just as it gained momentum, O'Connor faced yet more unexpected obstacles. In September 1900, newspaper editor Charles Vosper launched an extraordinary scare campaign warning that the dam would collapse.
Should such a catastrophe occur, an immense wall of water will descend upon the city, bringing with it all kinds of destruction, sweeping around like a maelstrom, destroying life and property wholesale. And the best part of South Perth will be swept out to sea.
To make matters worse, an English sailing ship carrying equipment for the pipeline was shipwrecked off the West Australian coast. It caused further delays. By now, the press was treating the water scheme as a bad joke, pointing the finger of blame squarely at O'Connor. Forrest's support became more and more critical.
It was fortunate for the colony to obtain a professional man with the grasp of our engineer-in-chief.
It's probable that O'Connor came to develop a dependency on Forrest. I think that increasingly Forrest had become the rock to whom O'Connor clung.
Forrest always backed O'Connor's judgment. I think it speaks volumes for the respect that Forrest had for O'Connor.
And I do not think he is extravagant. I think he is a most excellent officer.
With Forrest's protection, O'Connor pushed on with the scheme, and with the dam underway, the pipeline finally began to take shape. Hundreds of men worked on the scheme. Surveyors, trench diggers, blacksmiths, bricklayers and carpenters. 7 gangs of 30 men laid an average of 2 kilometres of pipe per day. Foundries in Germany, America and Britain supplied 76,000 tonnes of steel plate to be turned into more than 60,000 pipes at factories in Perth. At that time, it was the largest single order of steel in the world. But as the pipeline pushed its way east, Forrest faced the threat of losing the goldfields. With the prospect of Perth becoming the capital of an economically and politically isolated British colony, he battled to hold on to power. Only men had the right to vote, and Forrest knew the male-dominated goldfields might vote him out.
Such was the overwhelming power or numbers and proportion of men on the goldfields that every person had a vote. Whereas in the old towns, particularly Perth, they had roughly 50-50 men and women. So that for the same number of people, the old Western Australians only had half the number of votes. And if you gave votes to the women, you evened up the disparity.
Such was Forrest's desperation. that in August 1899, he took the historic step of making Western Australia one of the first places in the world to grant women the right to vote. He hoped it might secure his political future.
Forrest's motivation in supporting the right of women to vote was to do with trying to balance the political pressures that were coming from the goldfields, which was a very heavily male-dominated population.
I cannot, in the circumstances, press the matter further.
Forrest's future was decided when in 1900 the British government urged him to immediately bring the colony into federation. Afraid that Western Australia would now be left behind, Forrest finally agreed to a referendum. He had spent years preparing the colony for this moment, building the harbour, railways, roads, and the pipeline. He'd helped develop its economy and brought Western Australia into the 20th century. He had hoped to complete his grand vision for the colony before uniting the country, but time was running out. Now it was up to the people to decide.
Despite all the talk of Western Australia opposing federation and holding out until the last minute, when it actually came to the referendum on July the 31st, 1900, the people of Western Australia supported federation overwhelmingly.
The turnout and the yes vote were a record high. Western Australia's pro-federationists had won by a 2/3 majority. On the 1st of January 1901, in a ceremony in Sydney's Centennial Park, the Commonwealth of Australia was inaugurated. 6 self-governing colonies became a nation. The Cinderella state had only just made it to the Federation Ball. But it would mark the end of the partnership of Forrest and O'Connor that had endured so much. After almost a decade as Premier of Western Australia, John Forrest resigned to enter federal politics.
There's a tinge of sadness in my relinquishment of office, because I bid an everlasting farewell as Premier to that great work, the Coolgardie Water Scheme. I had been present at the birth of the project. I had protected it from its enemies in its infancy, and I had watched over it until it almost reached maturity. But now, I must hand it over to the care of others.
For Forrest, this was a triumphant moment, the end of a grand design and the culmination of his growing political ambitions. But for O'Connor, Forrest's departure would be fatal. Forrest's replacement as Premier, George Leake, was a known pipeline critic. Soon there would be more inquiries.
I think his Achilles heel was when Forrest left. He was really open to criticism and he couldn't cope with this. Forrest was like a buffer zone for him. And so without Forrest there, he had to deal with it all by himself.
Mr. O'Connor?
As work on the dam continued, the major challenge was finishing the pipeline. 65,000 pipes in all, each weighing over a ton. But now the work had reached its most frustrating stage. The process of hand caulking or sealing the pipes proved to be an incredibly arduous task. And by December 1901, progress was so slow that it threatened to derail the whole project.
A man would have to use a hammer and what's called a caulking tool, which is like a blunt chisel, and just gently hammer every joint on the joining rings. The joining rings had lead poured in there, so it was expanding the lead by hammering it to create a watertight seal.
Desperate to move ahead, and in a controversial turnaround, O'Connor approved the hiring of a private contractor, Couston, with automated caulking machines to speed up the work. But the move thrust O'Connor into a political scandal. The chief's right-hand man, Hodgson, had started to borrow money from Couston to buy up land along the route. a parliamentary select committee uncovered evidence of Hodgson's land deals.
It is open rumour everywhere that this Shire engineer from New Zealand has absolutely flourished on palm grease.
All that O'Connor knows about engineering may be contained in a very small book.
This man has exhibited such gross blundering, he has robbed the taxpayers of millions of pounds.
Nothing would give me greater pleasure than to see this whole thing smash up!
O'Connor was obviously in a state of crisis at this time. He was drinking heavily, he was spending large amounts of time by himself, so he was physically and mentally isolated. He was overworked and highly stressed and suffering from anxiety. He was questioning his own mind and whether he could complete the job under the barrage of criticism that had been levelled at him.
The charges that were laid at poor old O'Connor's door were shocking. It was felt that he was lining his own pocket. He was charged as corrupt without any evidence that he was. We know that he died a relatively poor man.
He was very worried about all the criticism. He took nearly all as a personal attack on himself. And he felt responsible for everything.
As an employee of the Public Works Department...
On the 19th of February, 1902, a royal commission was called to inquire into the conduct and completion of the Coolgardie water scheme. It would investigate all allegations of mismanagement and corruption and have the power to halt all construction work and recommend criminal charges.
Critical events were building up, and it was coming to a crisis point. It's my opinion, shared by others, that O'Connor was suffering from a mental breakdown.
He said the amount of abuse he was getting was almost more than he could bear. He spoke with little punctuation. He seemed to be strung up to the most terrible tension. He tried to multiply 43 by 3 and could not do it at the end. His hand shook so much.
On March the 10th, 1902, O'Connor sat down at his desk and wrote his suicide note.
The position has become impossible. Anxious, important work to do and 3 commissions of inquiry to attend to. We may not have done as well as possible in the past, but we'll necessarily be too hampered to do well in the imminent future. I feel that my brain is suffering, and I am in great fear of what effect all this worry may have upon me. I have lost control of my thoughts. The Coolgardie scheme is all right, and I could finish it if I got a chance and protection from misrepresentation, but there's no hope for that now. And it's better that it should be given to some entirely new man to do, who'll be untrammeled by prior responsibility. Put the wing walls to Helena Weir at once.
O'Connor rode his horse into the shallow water at South Beach, Fremantle.
This court has determined that Charles Yelverton O'Connor died by his own hand.
The coroner's court found that O'Connor committed suicide while in a state of mental derangement, caused by worry and overwork. But for O'Connor and the society in which he lived, honour and reputation meant everything.
If you've got a man of great integrity, convinced of the propriety of being a senior officer in public service, In a day when your reputation was in your name and your credit was in your handshake, he killed himself, right, as an act of comparable to falling on one's sword.
O'Connor's fate is to a large extent an early example of trial by media. I think the popular verdict that the Sunday Times killed him has a bit of rough justice in it. His last message was one about the technicalities of the engineering, but he made it clear that he still had faith in the project himself, and I can't help feeling that if Forrest had still been the Premier, that he probably would have seen him through the difficulties.
In December 1902, 5 years after construction had begun, and just 7 months after O'Connor's death, the final section of pipeline was in place.
Future generations will think of us and bless us for our far-seeing patriotism. And it will be said of us, as Isaiah said of old, that they have made their way in the wilderness and built rivers in the desert. I pay tribute to the memory of O'Connor, the great builder of this work. And I am greatly saddened that he did not live to receive the honor so justly due to him.
O'Connor provided Forrest with the knowledge, the innovation, the invention, the solutions to Forrest's dream of having Western Australia being part of a unified nation.
Western Australia has become one of the great sources of Australian wealth and one of the great parts of the Australian Commonwealth, which is something that the leaders of the Federation movement in the eastern colonies, who were prepared to go ahead without Western Australia, would have found very galling had they done so.
I now declare the Coolgardie pipeline open.
Nowhere had so much water been pumped so far. 566 kilometres of steel pipe supplying 25,000 kilolitres of water daily to the goldfields. 100 years on, nearly 60% of O'Connor's original pipeline remains, the longest freshwater pipeline in the world. An engineering feat that transformed a backward colony and a nation. C.Y. O'Connor was eventually vindicated by the Royal Commission, securing his reputation while highlighting the tragedy of his death. Sir John Forrest became Minister for Defence and Treasurer, serving in 5 federal ministries. Just before his death in 1918, he was raised to the British peerage, Lord Forrest, the first Baron of Bunbury.